Hello, welcome to the paper on Globalization, Development and Society. And today's module under discussion is Deconstructing Development. In today's lesson, we will try and understand what do we understand by development and try to deconstruct it. To explore the Ferguson and Escobar deconstruction of the term development, today's lesson would be divided into four parts. There would be an introduction, Arturo Escobar, the creation of underdevelopment, we are going to talk about that, and then James Ferguson, the development apparatus, and in the end, we are going to summarize today's lectures. So let's begin and understand what we intend to do in this paper on deconstructing development. This module studies the concept of deconstruction of development through the works of James Ferguson and Arturo Escobar. Both Ferguson and Escobar have critiqued the manner in which development has been conceptualized and applied in the period after the end of the World War II. Both authors have shown through their work that the creation of underdevelopment and the functioning of a development apparatus are in reality the byproduct of the unequal and hegemonic relations of power between the West and the rest of the world. It is the unequal relation of power that produces the knowledge, discourse, that informs the manner in which the development agenda is pursued in the form of various interventions by the development agencies and the sponsors within the third world. While offering insights into the functioning of the development industry or business, both the authors utilize concepts such as principles of authority, professionalization, development apparatus, depoliticization, and anti-politics machine to explain the thoroughness with which the development industry functions. While Escobar talks about the hybrid culture and an alternative to development as keys to looking beyond development, Ferguson brings to light the specific case study of the Thabazeka project in Lesotho to demonstrate the actual functioning of the development apparatus and the unintended impact it leaves on the locality. Harry Truman, the third president of the United States of America, used the term underdeveloped areas to refer to countries of the southern hemisphere, while announcing that the developed areas of the world must focus their development-related programs for the upliftment of these areas. In the field of development studies, Truman's call for the scientific and technological advancement of underdeveloped areas which is considered to be the beginning of the age of underdevelopment. Escobar notes that the Truman was ambitious since he aimed to create in the economically less developed countries of the world sufficient conditions required to emulate the type of advancement seen in the developed West. Such advancement was characterized by high levels of industrialization and urbanization, technicalization of agriculture, rapid growth of material production and living standards, and the widespread adoption of modern education and cultural values. In order to achieve Western level of advancement, the basic requirement were capital and scientific and technological know-how. Soon after Truman's call to generate development in underdeveloped regions used money, science and technology, other industrially advanced and politically influential countries of the West took interest in this project. This call came at the end of the Second World War. By this time, the UNO, or the United Nations Organization, was set up with the help of experts from the UN and Western academicians. There was a thrust to completely restructure the economy, polity, and society and culture of underdeveloped country so as to create enabling conditions to emulate Western development goals. So the call for development was twofold: material and economic progress on the one hand, and the complete modernization of the way of the life of the underdeveloped on the other. Arturo Escobar, in his book Encountering Development, The Making and Unmaking of the Third World, attempts to show that the dream of the Western politician and academician to materially and economically transform underdeveloped society as mirror image of Western societies had failed. Escobar presents this book as the history of the loss of an illusion in which many genuinely believed. Most importantly for Escobar, his book demonstrates how the third world as we know it today is actually the product of the development discourse and the interventions that are based on the discourse. From the 1950 onward, the United Nations declared development decades to emphasize the urgency with which the Western world was pursuing development as an agenda. Escobar points out that the concept of development evolved from economic to social to basic needs to sustainable and continues to evolve. For instance, whereas in the 1950s, the focus of International Development Organization was to push exclusively for economic growth measured by income, but by the 1970s rolled in, the focus had shifted to basic needs, which emphasized upon redistribution of the wealth. Today, sustainable development is the talking point for International Development Organization. Escobar attributes this attitude towards development to a Western worldview, which has come to accept development as the natural outcome of the evolution of society using simple agricultural modes of production to more complex industrial ones. Development, in particular, industrial development, is projected as the highest form of evolution that societies all over the world must attain to escape from the undignified state of underdevelopment. There has been an attempt to promote the development process as the outcome of a historical discourse. The aim of this discourse is to understand why some countries perceive themselves as understood and try to become developed through systematic and planned development intervention. The government and the experts of North America and West Europe contributed to this discourse by perceiving the predominantly agriculture and pre-economized societies of the world as underdeveloped areas requiring their urgent intervention for material and cultural advancement. It is the perception of this group that created a new intellectual space in which the concept of development strategies for dealing with backwardness were fashioned. For Escobar, demeaning representation of the third and the first world have been characterized of development literature. The great drawback with this image creation is that it projects third world culture in a standard manner and places them grossly out of context. It would seem that the only manner in which the third world can be understood is in terms of Western categorization and description, which is more a sign of the unequal power relation between the first and the third world rather than any fair or truthful description of historical reality. According to Escobar, the predominance of the Western worldview is the result of its hegemonic relation with the rest of the world, which has had an acute and many a time adverse impact on the polity, economy, culture, and society of the third world societies. Escobar uses the term regimes of representation to examine the manner in which the third world identities are constructed through such representation and the consequences of these representations on their societies. As per Escobar, and I quote, "It is the government, experts, planners, and academicians of the first world who have created an extremely efficient apparatus for producing knowledge about and the exercise of power over the third world." Quote close. It is this apparatus that has shaped development discourse the world over ever since the end of World War II. Further, the development discourse has been translated into practice through intervention such as rural development, infrastructure, and sustainable development projects in the third world, in which first world institutions and bilateral donors have pumped in copious amounts of money. The practice of critiquing the established development discourse began, according to Escobar, in the later half of the 1980s. Efforts included the creation of alternative regimes of representation and practices for development-related intervention. However, the same cannot be said about efforts to deconstruct the development discourse, although a few third world intellectuals have critiqued Western notions of colonialism history, tradition, domination, and development, and calling for a restructuring of the development discourse. For instance, the anthropological discipline has undergone a restructuring of sorts in the 1980s, due to which anthropologists have started to look at the third world culture and context not as subject but as something to be engaged with in a more interactive fashion located within their own historically specific context. Escobar notes that in the aftermath of the World War II, there was a concern among leaders of the developed nation that poverty and inequality in the third world were genuine challenges to the stability of the world order. It was at this time that American President Truman called for the war on poverty in the third world gained momentum. He announced that the southern hemisphere consisted of underdeveloped area, resulted in poverty being elevated to the status of a global social problem and the perception of development and poverty in a purely economic terms. From then on, a country standing in the old world order was determined by the degree of its national income. Escobar quotes studies that show a connection between the end of the colonialism in the Third World and the emergence of the discourse of development. It is seen by many as a restructuring of the relations between the formerly colonized countries and the colonizer in such a way that the European countries and the North America could continue their hold over these newly independent countries. One of the strategies used in this way was to modernize local population with the help of capital, technology, and development expert, which ultimately led to the decline of traditional social practices. Escobar notes that one example of the process of modernization of local population was seen in the rise of community development program in the 1950s in the developing world and the newly independent region. Let's now discuss the discourse of development and try and understand what we mean by this discourse. By discourse, Escobar means that a space was created where only certain things qualified as being compatible with what constitutes development. Through this discourse, a certain notion of what constitutes reality was created. To understand the origins of development as discourse, Escobar goes back to the basic premises related to development which originated after the World War II. The basic premises were founded on the belief that the priority for development should be the material advancement of nations that would be crucial for social, cultural, and political advancement in the long run. So the basic premises of development discourse includes, firstly, the belief that modernization is the only force that would challenge traditional and superstitious belief and practices prevalent in the third world country, as these values are obstacles to prosperity. Secondly, the perception that modernization can be achieved through industrialization and urbanization to achieve material progress. Thus, underdeveloped country would require capital and technology which they would obtain from the developed countries. The transfer of capital and technology would take place under the aegis of Western government and development organization. It is through the establishment of this set of relations that the development discourse is able to portray concepts, theories, and practices which are its hallmarks as a systematic whole and gives them a certain kind of legitimacy. For Escobar, there are different approaches by which the question of alternative to the current development discourse can be dealt with. They are, firstly, there are resistance movements that have time and again expressed discontent with the dominant development paradigm. Resistance movements have risen as a challenge to the dominant development discourse, not just in Latin America, but in other developing countries as well. In his view, creating ethnographies of the impact of development discourse and the hybrid culture that emerge within specific localities can provide rich material on where these communities stand on the cultural scale vis-a-vis development. In the end, for Escobar, the issue of alternative as a research question in social practice can be best understood from the concrete settings in which they are manifested. In other words, the alternative already exists. However, they have to be read differently from the current practices, which has glossed over the differences in culture and the hybrid forms that emerge as a result of the engagement with modernity and development. Ferguson studies a specific development. Now we try and understand the development apparatus as deliberated by James Ferguson. Ferguson studies a specific development intervention that took place in southern African country of Lesotho in the 1970s in his book titled The Anti-Politics Machine. The World Bank and the Canadian International Development Agency were the main funder of this intervention called Thaba Tiska Project. Lesotho, a former British protectorate, became independent in the year 1966. Ferguson notes that between 1975 and 1984, Lesotho received development-related bilateral assistance from 27 countries from all over the world. Included in this list were USA, the United Kingdom, Canada, the Federal Republic of Germany, the Democratic Republic of Germany, Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland on the one hand, and India, Iran, Ghana, Israel, and Libya, to name a few, on the other. In addition to the bilateral assistance, Lesotho also received during this period development assistance from more than 70 international agencies from all over the world. It was this proliferation of expatriate agencies and the resident experts in Maseru, the capital of Lesotho, that drove Ferguson to undertake a study of the rationale and implication of this high degree of what he called internationalist intervention. Ferguson points out that Lesotho did not seem to be a country of the great economic or strategic importance, which was why the keen degree of interest in that country by development expert was a matter of Curiosity. According to Ferguson, while the projected aim of development aid to Lesotho was poverty alleviation, economic growth and reduction of the country's dependence on its bigger and stronger neighbor South Africa, a major chunk of this money had in reality been spent on rural development projects. Ferguson points out to the FAO, that is Food and Agriculture Organization report published in the year 1977, which shows that there were more than 200 rural development projects underway in Lesotho. The irony is that the existence of a large number of development projects and the money to sponsor to all of them had not prevented any of these projects from failing to meet their explicit development goals. Despite persistent failures, Ferguson notes the existence of individuals and institutions that were willing to take up new development project. In fact, Ferguson notes that for the development industry in Lesotho and other developed parts of the world as well, Ferguson used the term development within double quote throughout his book. Failure appears to be the norm. He focuses his attention on the conceptualization, planning, and implementation of a specific rural development project. He places the term rural development within the double quotes called the Thaba-Seiska project. Ferguson notes that the development apparatus of development machinery seem to be working in Lesotho constitute a much larger global phenomena. Though meticulously planned and implemented, all of them inevitably seem to have failed in their original objective. This phenomena of pumping generous amounts of money for persistently failing development intervention in the third world country is what Ferguson labels the development industry promoted by a development apparatus. To understand the functioning of the development apparatus, Ferguson firstly focuses his theoretical concern on development as a social phenomena with its own set of associated characteristics consisting mainly of the set of development institutions, agencies, and ideologies. His studies anthropological and his principal subjects are not the people of Lesotho who are the targeted beneficiary of the development intervention, but the development apparatus itself and the manner it plays out within the context of Lesotho. Ferguson analysis of the discourse in the World Bank Country Report on Lesotho in 1975 titled World Bank Country Report on Lesotho, he notes that Lesotho as a developing country had a bleak economic prospect, was ill-prepared and virtually untouched by modern economic development, existed as a traditional subsistence peasant society showing signs of rapid population growth and declining agricultural yields, with the only employment opportunity being in the neighboring South Africa, which had led to the creation of a new male labor force away as migrant workers in South Africa. The economic isolation of Lesotho, or it being a traditional subsistence society, or the emergence of migration for work as a new phenomenon propelled by growing population and declining agricultural yields that the report claims it found in Lesotho at the time of its independence seems to be far from truth. Ferguson notes that the preamble of the report ignores the fact that the seeds for the economic transformation of Lesotho had been sown in the past. Rather, it points to the future growth trajectory initiated by development intervention by organizations such as itself to bring Lesotho back on track that is on path to economic development. Ferguson points out to the dichotomy that exists between the academic and development discourse on Lesotho. While attempting to deconstruct the development discourse on Lesotho, Ferguson clarifies that the discursive field that he is dealing with is purely that which has been initiated by development agencies that have intervened in Lesotho during the middle and the late 1970s. Ferguson begins his deconstruction by noting that the disparity between academic and development discourse on Lesotho is not due to lack of intellectual capacity on the part of those who produce the development discourse, but due to the different way in which the rules of discourse in academic and development discourse are constructed. He calls this two different types of problematics. Ferguson does not try to judge the development discourse from an academic perspective. Rather, he tries to understand the framework within which this discourse is produced by taking the incompatibility between development discourse and academic norms as a point of departure. Ferguson starts by explaining that what seems to be glaring falsities pertaining to Lesotho in the World Bank report are essential steps in the necessary theoretical task of constituting the complex reality of Lesotho as a less developed country, and thereby setting the stage for a development-related intervention of a particular kind. Ferguson in this concept calls the term LDC, or less developed country, a theoretical construct. According to Ferguson, the idea of bringing together the notion of less developed countries in the context of Lesotho is contradictory. This is so because it conflates two different conceptions of the term development. One is the linear conception of development, meaning the evolution of society from a less developed, that is an agricultural pre-capitalist society, to a more developed, that is an industrial capitalist society. The second is the conception of development, which means an improvement in the quality of the life of people through the elevation of poverty. However, Ferguson notes that capitalism, which is what first conception calls for, and poverty elevation, the aim of the second conceptions, are not always compatible. So he considers the coinage of the term less developed countries to be an ideal example of the fallacious conflation of these two conceptions of development. By using the term LDC for Lesotho, it is shown as economically isolated and not at all integrated into the world economy, due to which its economy remains backward, primordial, and unpenetrated, therefore resulting in chronic poverty in that country. The World Bank solution is to intervene with a rural development project aimed to modernize and monetize rural Lesotho. Included in the modernization and monetization drive is the introduction of roads, markets, credit, and modern values to replace what are seen to be the traditional values that obstruct the modernization of Lesotho's economy. There is a tendency in development discourse to look at development as a result of plans and projects conceived by the development apparatus, and any failure of it to be seen as the effect of government negligence. The government tends to be projected as an apolitical planner and implementer of development-related projects to which the bureaucracy naturally responds. The development discourse, according to Ferguson, steers clear of the dynamics that operates within the political class in any country. Instead, it projects the lack of development solely as the failure of state planning. According to Ferguson, the World Bank report is purely technical and leaves out crucial political and structural factors that have an impact on the way in which a government and its people interact with each other. Moreover, he asserts there is a clear logic behind the continuous reproduction of such a fallacious theoretical construction. The main reason why development discourse such as that of the World Bank studiously avoids more historically and contextually rooted academic discourse on LDC is that it needs to promote a discursive field within which it can, without hindrance, operate or intervene in a country identified as LDC. Technical problems have solutions which development agencies provide in standardized packages such as infrastructure development, rural development, irrigation schemes, and so on. These packages play the additional role of moving money and resources which the development agencies have in plenty. So according to Ferguson, the aim of these development agencies is to look for a problem for which they have the right resources as well as the solution. The anti-politics machine. Ferguson notes that the Thaba-Seska project was deemed as a failure by the year 1979, not only in development and academic circle, but in the media and amongst the local population as well. So by 1984, the Thaba-Seska project had been discontinued on grounds of merit. However, Ferguson notes that it cannot be deemed a failure in all respects. In fact, there were what he calls certain side effects of the project. These include the construction of the road that links Thaba-Seska to the capital Lesotho and the setting up of new district administration in the region, thereby making for a stronger government presence there. The point that Ferguson makes is that the Thaba-Seska project did not plan the setting up of the new district administration, the extension of government services, and control or increased military presence in the region. What the project has done is to play an instrumental role that resulted in this unexpected outcome. For Ferguson, such outcome of development projects have an intelligibility of their own, which goes beyond what the development planners originally intend. These are instrument effects, because they are simultaneously effects and instrument for what turns out to be an exercise of power by the state. Thus, in such a view, the aim of development apparatus is the strengthening of the government control and not the elevation of the poverty. Ferguson notes that the development project is depoliticized by reducing poverty to a technical problem for which the intervention will provide technical solution. However, it ends up playing the unintentional political function of expanding and strengthening state institutions in the region. Since the project is promoted as a neutral, technical mission, it is not something which people or countries can challenge. So, the instrument effect has two characteristics. One is the institutional effect, in which state control is expanded, and the second is the ideological effect, in which both poverty and state become depoliticized. This is what Ferguson calls the anti-politics machine. In other words, The entire development exercise is depoliticized while playing one of the most sensitive of political function, the expansion of institutional state control within the region, as has been in the case of Lesotho. To conclude, from the study of the works of Escobar and Ferguson, it is clear that development as an agenda, discourse, and practice is fundamentally political. Development promotes the agenda of certain countries of the West, which have the resources, the power, and the experts to pursue certain forms of interventionism in areas of the world that have been designated as underdeveloped. It is also clear from the module that a phenomenon as political as development is depoliticized and projected as scientific, technical, and neutral through the development discourse to mute any challenge that might be posed to the transfer of capital, technology, and knowledge from the West to the so-called third world countries. Moreover, the works of Ferguson and Escobar show that development interventions are not necessarily tailor-made to suit the requirements of specific localities. Rather, they are implemented in the form of standardized packages, such as rural development and sustainable development globally. The critique of development points to the persistent failure of this type of interventionism and shows why, despite these failures due to the political nature of development, the knowledge produced by the development discourse and the practices it generates continue to be promoted as legitimate and true. However, the current development paradigm is challenged not only by academicians, but also by the resistance movement in the developing world, which have taken the lead in denouncing what they perceive to be attempts to superimpose Western knowledge, practices, and customs on the local one. While suggestions for alternative to the current development paradigm recommend that power be transferred to the locals so that they can decide how best to respond to the influx of modernity and development in the region, these needs to be researched and analyzed more thoroughly in terms of the implications that they can have for development discourse and practice on the one hand, and for the local communities on the other. Thank you.